Jeremy Bentham begins his philosophy with a very simple observation about human nature. Every human being constantly moves toward pleasure and away from pain. Whether people realize it or not, their decisions are shaped by these two forces. According to Bentham, pleasure and pain are the two masters that guide human life. They influence what people choose, what they avoid, and how they judge what is good or bad. Bentham believed that if we truly want to understand morality, law, and society, we must begin with this basic fact about human behavior. Instead of building moral systems based on tradition, religion, or abstract rules, he wanted to examine what actually affects human happiness. For him, the most important question in ethics was simple. What actions increase happiness, and what actions increase suffering? From this starting point, Bentham developed the principle that became the foundation of his philosophy. This idea is called the principle of utility. According to the principle of utility, an action is right if it increases happiness and wrong if it produces unnecessary suffering. In other words, the value of any action should be judged by its consequences for human well-being. Bentham believed that morality should not be mysterious or complicated. Instead, it should be practical and understandable. If an action brings more happiness to people, it is morally good. If it causes more pain than pleasure, it is morally bad. This idea may seem simple, but Bentham believed it had enormous implications for how societies should organize their laws, governments, and institutions. To understand his philosophy more clearly, it is important to look at how Bentham defined happiness. For him, happiness was not an abstract spiritual idea. It was the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. Pleasure includes experiences like comfort, enjoyment, friendship, safety, learning, and satisfaction. Pain includes suffering, fear, discomfort, loss, and harm. Human beings naturally prefer the first and try to avoid the second. Bentham believed that moral thinking should take these experiences seriously. Instead of focusing on traditions or authority, ethical decisions should focus on how actions affect the happiness of real people. A good society is one that increases pleasure and reduces suffering for as many people as possible. This idea led Bentham to one of his most famous principles. The best action is the one that creates the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. This phrase later became the core of a philosophical approach known as utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the idea that moral decisions should aim to maximize overall happiness. Bentham's approach was very different from earlier moral philosophies that focused on duty or divine commands. Instead of asking whether an action follows a rule, Bentham asked whether the action improves the well-being of those affected by it. This made his philosophy very practical. It encouraged people to think carefully about the real consequences of their actions. Bentham also believed that happiness could be analyzed and measured in a rational way. He suggested that when judging an action, we should consider several factors. These include how intense the pleasure or pain is, how long it lasts, how likely it is to occur, and how many people it affects. By thinking carefully about these factors, people can make more thoughtful and responsible moral decisions. This idea became known as the calculus of pleasure and pain. Bentham believed that just as people calculate costs and benefits in everyday life, they could also evaluate the moral consequences of their actions in a similar way. The goal was always the same: increase the total amount of happiness in the world and reduce unnecessary suffering. Bentham's philosophy did not only apply to individual decisions. He believed it should also guide the design of laws and political systems. Governments exist to serve the people, and the success of a government should be judged by how much happiness it produces for its citizens. Laws that create unnecessary suffering should be changed or removed. At the time Bentham lived, many legal systems were extremely harsh and unfair. Punishments were often cruel and did not necessarily improve society. Bentham criticized these systems because they focused on tradition rather than human well-being. He believed that punishment should only exist if it helps reduce future harm and improve overall happiness. For example, if a punishment is extremely severe but does not actually prevent crime or protect people, then it only increases suffering without creating benefits. In Bentham's view, such punishments are morally wrong because they fail the test of utility. Laws should aim to prevent harm, encourage good behavior, and improve the lives of the people they affect. Bentham also believed that governments should always consider the happiness of all individuals, not just the powerful or wealthy. Every person's pleasure and pain matter equally in moral calculations. This idea challenged social systems that gave special privileges to certain groups while ignoring the suffering of others. Because of this belief, Bentham supported many social reforms. He argued for improvements in prisons, education, and legal systems. He also supported greater political representation so that laws would reflect the interests of the entire population rather than a small elite. Through these ideas, Bentham created a new way of thinking about morality and politics. Instead of relying on tradition or authority, he asked people to examine the real consequences of actions and policies. The goal was always clear. A good society is one that increases happiness and reduces suffering for as many people as possible. This simple but powerful idea became the starting point for one of the most influential ethical theories in modern philosophy. Bentham believed that by focusing on human happiness, societies could create fairer laws, more humane institutions, and a better world for everyone. After establishing that pleasure and pain guide human behavior, he continued exploring a deeper question. If the goal of morality is to increase happiness and reduce suffering, how can people actually judge which actions produce the most happiness? In everyday life, decisions often affect many people at the same time. Some choices bring pleasure to one person but pain to another. Some bring immediate enjoyment but later cause problems. Because of this complexity, he believed that moral thinking should be careful and systematic rather than based on habit or emotion. To solve this problem, he suggested that pleasures and pains could be examined through several characteristics. By thinking about these characteristics, people could compare the results of different actions more clearly. The purpose was not to turn morality into cold mathematics, but to encourage thoughtful reflection about consequences. One important factor is intensity. Some pleasures are mild and barely noticeable, while others are powerful and deeply satisfying. In the same way, some pains are small irritations while others are severe and overwhelming. When evaluating an action, it is important to consider how strong the pleasure or pain will be for the people involved. Another factor is duration. A pleasure that lasts for only a moment may not be as valuable as one that continues for a long time. A brief enjoyment might feel exciting at first, but disappear quickly. Meanwhile, a steady and lasting form of happiness can shape a person's life in a more meaningful way. The same applies to pain. A short discomfort may not matter much, but long-lasting suffering has a much greater effect on well-being. Certainty is another element that must be considered. Some actions are very likely to produce a particular result, while others involve a great deal of uncertainty. If a decision promises great happiness but has only a small chance of actually achieving it, that uncertainty must be taken into account. Wise decisions consider not only the possible results, but also how likely those results are to happen. He also believed people should think about timing. Some pleasures arrive immediately, while others appear only after patience and effort. Immediate pleasure can be tempting because it feels close and easy. Yet sometimes a person must accept temporary difficulty in order to achieve greater happiness later. For this reason, thoughtful decision-making requires attention to both present and future consequences. Another important consideration is whether a pleasure leads to further pleasures. Some experiences create positive chains of events that continue over time. For example, learning new skills may require effort in the beginning, but the knowledge gained can bring many future benefits. It can open opportunities, create confidence, and improve quality of life. In such cases, the initial pleasure or effort becomes the starting point of many other good outcomes. The opposite can also occur. Some pleasures appear enjoyable at first, but lead to future pain. Actions that bring excitement in the moment may create regret, harm, or loss later. Because of this, it is important to look beyond the immediate moment and examine the longer path that follows from a decision. Another important element involves how many people are affected by the action. Happiness and suffering do not belong only to individuals in isolation. Every action can influence families, communities, and even entire societies. A choice that brings small happiness to many people may be more valuable than one that gives intense pleasure to only a single person. Each person's happiness counts equally, and moral thinking should respect that equality. When these ideas are combined, they create a method for examining actions carefully. By considering the strength, length, likelihood, timing, and spread of pleasure and pain, people can judge which choices are most likely to increase overall happiness. The goal is always the same. Encourage what produces well-being and reduce what creates unnecessary suffering. This way of thinking also changed how he approached politics and law. Governments often make decisions that affect thousands or even millions of people. Because of this enormous influence, political decisions should not be guided by tradition alone. They should be guided by their consequences for human happiness. If a law protects people, prevents harm, and improves quality of life, it serves its purpose well. But if a law causes suffering without producing clear benefits, then it fails its moral test. Old traditions, social habits, or the authority of powerful groups should not be enough to justify harmful rules. Every law should be examined by asking a simple question: does it increase the well-being of the people it governs? This perspective made him a strong critic of many legal systems of his time. Some punishments were extremely harsh, yet did little to prevent crime. Others existed simply because they had always existed, even though they created unnecessary suffering. He believed such laws should be reformed or removed. Punishment itself raised an important problem. Since punishment creates pain, it must always be justified carefully. Pain should never be introduced into society without a clear reason. The only justification for punishment is that it prevents greater suffering in the future. If punishing a crime discourages others from committing the same act and protects innocent people, it can increase overall happiness. However, if punishment is excessive, cruel, or ineffective, it simply adds more suffering to the world without solving the problem. In that case, it becomes morally wrong. The goal of justice should not be revenge, but prevention. A well-designed legal system should focus on reducing harm and encouraging better behavior rather than simply inflicting pain. These ideas pushed his philosophy beyond personal morality and into social reform. Institutions such as prisons, courts, and governments should always be evaluated by their impact on human well-being. If they fail to serve that purpose, they should be redesigned to work better. Through this approach, morality becomes closely connected with real-life conditions. Poverty, inequality, crime, and injustice are not abstract problems. They affect the happiness and suffering of real people. By applying careful reasoning and focusing on the consequences of actions, societies can gradually improve these conditions. The central idea remains simple but powerful. The purpose of moral thinking, law, and political organization is to create a world where happiness is more common and suffering is reduced as much as possible. Every decision, whether made by an individual or by government, should be examined with that goal in mind. As his thinking continued to develop, he began applying the principle of utility to many areas of society, especially the structure of laws and political institutions. He believed that laws should never exist simply because they have existed for a long time. Tradition alone is not a good reason to keep a rule or a punishment. Every law should be examined carefully and judged by a simple standard. Does it increase the happiness of the people who live under it, or does it create unnecessary suffering? If a law protects individuals, prevents harm, and helps people live better lives, then it is justified. But if a law causes pain without producing real benefits, then it should be changed or removed. This approach made him a strong critic of many legal systems in his time. Courts were often slow, expensive, and confusing. Ordinary people could struggle for years to resolve simple disputes. Punishments were sometimes harsh and inconsistent, and the system often protected the interests of the wealthy more than the well-being of the general population. He believed that such systems were irrational because they failed to serve the true purpose of law. The purpose of law is not to protect tradition or power. Its purpose is to promote the greatest happiness of the community. Because of this belief, he supported major legal reforms. Laws should be written clearly so that ordinary people can understand them. Complex language and confusing procedures only create frustration and injustice. When people cannot understand the law, they cannot follow it properly or defend themselves when conflicts arise. Clear laws, accessible courts, and fair procedures help reduce suffering and create a more stable society. Punishment remained one of the most important topics in his philosophy. Since punishment causes pain, it must always be justified by greater benefit. Punishment should exist only when it helps prevent future harm. If punishing a crime discourages others from committing similar acts, then it can protect society and reduce suffering overall. But punishment should never be more severe than necessary. Excessive punishment only creates additional suffering without improving public safety. He believed that a well-designed system of justice should focus on prevention rather than revenge. The goal is not simply to make offenders suffer for what they have done. The goal is to reduce crime and protect the community. This means understanding the causes of harmful behavior and creating conditions that encourage better choices. Laws should guide people toward actions that benefit society rather than merely punishing them after harm has already occurred. One of the most famous ideas connected to his thinking about punishment was a design for prisons known as the panopticon. This design was based on a simple principle of observation. The prison would be built so that a single guard could observe many prisoners at once, while the prisoners would never know exactly when they were being watched. Because they might be observed at any moment, prisoners would be encouraged to behave properly even when no one was actively watching them. The idea behind this design was not simply control, but efficiency. Instead of using large numbers of guards or harsh punishments to maintain order, the structure itself would encourage discipline and self-control. By reducing chaos and encouraging responsible behavior, the prison could function more effectively and with less suffering. Although this design later became controversial and raised concerns about constant surveillance, it reflected a consistent theme in his philosophy. Institutions should be designed in ways that promote useful behavior and minimize unnecessary pain. Systems that rely only on force or cruelty often fail to produce lasting improvement. His ideas also extended to political systems. Governments have enormous influence over the happiness of the people they govern. Laws determine how property is protected, how disputes are resolved, and how opportunities are distributed. Because of this power, political authority must be held accountable to the principle of utility. A government that increases the well-being of its citizens is legitimate. But a government that ignores the suffering of the population or protects only the interests of small group fails its moral responsibility. Public policies should always be examined according to their real effects on people's lives. Do they create opportunity, safety, and well-being, or do they increase hardship and inequality? He believed that every person's happiness counts equally in moral calculations. The pleasure of one individual is not more valuable simply because that person is wealthy, powerful, or socially important. Each human life has equal significance when evaluating the balance between happiness and suffering. This belief supported the idea that political systems should represent the interests of the entire population rather than only a privileged minority. Because of this principle, he supported democratic reforms and broader participation in political decision-making. When more people have a voice in government, laws are more likely to reflect the real needs and experiences of the population. A system dominated by a small elite may overlook the struggles of ordinary citizens and create policies that benefit only a few. Another area where he applied his philosophy was social welfare. Poverty, illness, and lack of education all produce suffering that spreads throughout society. A community where large numbers of people struggle with basic needs cannot achieve widespread happiness. Helping individuals gain access to education, health, and stable living conditions increases the overall well-being of the population. This does not mean that every difficulty in life can or should be removed. Challenges and effort are part of human existence. But when suffering results from preventable conditions such as unfair laws, poor institutions, or lack of opportunity, society has a responsibility to address those problems. Through these reflections, his philosophy became more than a simple moral rule about pleasure and pain. It became a broad framework for evaluating the structures that shape human life. Laws, governments, prisons, economic systems, and social institutions all influence the happiness of the people who live within them. By examining these systems carefully and improving them where necessary, societies can gradually reduce suffering and expand opportunities for well-being. At the center of this vision remains a straightforward but powerful idea. The purpose of ethics, politics, and law is not to preserve tradition or maintain authority. Their purpose is to serve the happiness of human beings. Every decision and every institution should be measured by how well it fulfills that purpose. As his philosophy reached its most mature stage, the central idea remained clear and consistent. Human life is guided by the search for pleasure and the avoidance of pain. From this simple observation, he built a complete vision of ethics, law, and social organization. The purpose of morality is not to obey traditions without question or follow rules simply because they exist. The purpose of morality is to improve the conditions of human life by increasing happiness and reducing suffering wherever possible. This principle may appear simple at first, yet it has profound consequences when applied seriously. Every action, every law, and every institution can be examined through the same question. Does it contribute to the happiness of the people affected by it, or does it produce unnecessary pain? By asking this question consistently, individuals and societies can make decisions that move life in a more positive direction. One of the most powerful aspects of this philosophy is the idea that every person's happiness matters equally. The pleasure experienced by one individual is not inherently more valuable than the pleasure experienced by another. Social rank, wealth, and status do not give someone's happiness greater importance. When evaluating the effects of an action or policy, each person's well-being must be counted with the same weight. This principle challenges systems that concentrate benefits among a small group while ignoring the suffering of many others. If a policy greatly benefits a few people but causes harm to a large number of others, it cannot be justified under the principle of utility. A just society must aim to distribute benefits in ways that increase overall happiness rather than protecting the privileges of a minority. At the same time, this philosophy requires careful thinking about the complexity of human life. Pleasure and pain are not always obvious or immediate. Some decisions that appear pleasant at first can create problems later, while certain sacrifices may produce greater benefits in the future. For this reason, thoughtful reflection is always necessary. Decisions should consider long-term consequences as well as immediate effects. He believed that individuals could improve their lives by applying this reasoning to everyday choices. Instead of acting impulsively or blindly following habits, people could pause and consider the likely consequences of their actions. By choosing options that create more lasting happiness and avoid unnecessary harm, individuals can gradually build better lives for themselves and others. This way of thinking also encourages responsibility. Actions are not isolated events. Every decision influences other people in ways that may extend far beyond the immediate moment. A small act of kindness can spread positive effects through relationships and communities. In the same way, careless actions can create harm that continues long after the original decision has been forgotten. Recognizing this interconnectedness encourages people to think more carefully about the impact of their behavior. In the realm of government, the implications are even greater. Political institutions have enormous influence over the happiness and suffering of entire populations. Laws shape opportunities, determine how conflicts are resolved, and influence the conditions under which people live and work. Because of this power, governments have a responsibility to design policies that genuinely improve human well-being. A successful political system should protect individuals from harm, encourage cooperation, and create conditions where people can pursue fulfilling lives. When laws promote safety, fairness, education, and opportunity, they contribute to the happiness of the community. When laws create unnecessary restrictions, protect narrow interests, or ignore the suffering of ordinary people, they fail to serve their purpose. One important aspect of this philosophy is its emphasis on reform. Institutions are not perfect or permanent. As societies change, laws and systems must also evolve. Practices that once seemed acceptable may later be recognized as harmful or inefficient. Instead of preserving them out of habit, societies should be willing to examine them critically and make improvements. This attitude encourages progress. Problems such as injustice, poverty, and ineffective institutions are not fixed features of human life. They can be studied, understood, and improved through thoughtful policies guided by concern for human happiness. Each reform that reduces suffering or increases opportunity moves society closer to the goal of greater overall well-being. Another powerful feature of this philosophy is its practicality. Rather than relying on abstract ideas about moral perfection, it focuses on real experiences of pleasure and pain. Happiness is something people can recognize in their own lives. Suffering is something they naturally wish to avoid. By grounding ethics in these universal experiences, the philosophy becomes accessible and relevant to everyday life. It also encourages compassion. When people recognize that others experience pleasure and pain just as they do, it becomes easier to understand why the happiness of others matters. Ethical decisions are not only about personal benefit, but about contributing to the well-being of the larger community. The recognition that every individual's happiness counts equally creates a moral foundation for fairness and cooperation. Over time, this approach influenced many areas of thought, including economics, politics, and social reform. Later thinkers expanded and refined the ideas, developing more detailed versions of utilitarian philosophy. Yet the core insight remained the same. Human actions and institutions should be judged by their consequences for human happiness. In everyday life, this perspective invites a simple but powerful habit of reflection. Before making decisions, individuals can ask themselves whether their choices will likely increase happiness or create unnecessary suffering. This question encourages patience, responsibility, and consideration for others. Through this philosophy, a vision of moral life emerges that is both practical and hopeful. Human beings are capable of improving their conditions by thinking carefully about the consequences of their actions. By valuing happiness, reducing harm, and treating each person's well-being as equally important, individuals and societies can move toward a more humane and balanced world. In the end, the message of this philosophy is clear and direct. The purpose of morality, law, and social organization is not to serve tradition, authority, or narrow interests. It is to promote the greatest possible happiness for the greatest number of people. When this principle guides decisions, the result is a society that steadily moves away from unnecessary suffering and toward a life where well-being, fairness, and human flourishing become the central goals of collective existence.